Lydia Cabral, I'm a research fellow here at IDS. It's a pleasure to host this first seminar of the series organized by the Food Equity Center. So I'll just tell you a little bit about the Food Equity Center, which is an international network of researchers and practitioners, which include partners in the UK, Brazil, South Africa, as well as global partners like the World Vegetable Center. So check our webpage and our Twitter account to hear more about us. It's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Tara Garnett in person. We're having this seminar as a hybrid experiment, and as you've noticed, we're still trying to get the grips of the technology. But we were very happy that Dr. Garnett accepted to come in person. It's really nice to be able to interact face to face. It's looking a little bit empty here at IDS, unfortunately, but I can see there's many people online and people from across Europe and indeed the world. I noticed at least a colleague from Brazil, so welcome you all, those of you online. We'll have the chance to have a conversation with Tara in a minute, and you'll get the chance to ask questions in the chat, so we'll come to that. But let me now introduce you to the speaker, Dr. Tara Garnett. She's the director of Table, and we'll hear a little bit about Table, which is an exciting platform that many of you I'm sure are familiar with. It's a collaboration between the University of Oxford, the Swedish University of Agrarian Sciences, and Wageningen University of Research. So Tara worked on food issues for over 25 years with both the NGO and academic sectors. Since 2012, she's been a researcher at the Environmental Change Institute at the University of Oxford, a fellow of the Oxford Martin School, and part of the Wellcome Trust-funded LEAP project. In 2005, she founded the Food Climate Research Network, which is Table's precursor. We'll hear a little bit about that. Tara has a degree in English literature from the University of Oxford, a master's in development studies from the School of Oriental and African Studies in London, and a PhD from the Center for Environmental Strategy at the University of Surrey. In 2015, she was awarded the Premio Daniel, the prize Daniel Carasso, an international award that recognizes outstanding contributions on the topic of sustainable food and diets for long-term human health. So, Tara, very welcome to you. Very glad to have you here. Welcome to IDS. You'll be talking about what we really mean when we talk about food. So, what's your answer to that? Exciting question.
Thank you. Thank you.
Please unmute yourself.
I'll leave myself. Great, thank you very much. So how do I turn this back to my presentation? Great, thank you very much. So hopefully everyone can see my presentation, and if I'm not loud enough, please say so in the chat. It's very nice to be here, and also extremely weird because other than Dominic, Lydia, and my colleague Tamsin, there are only two actual real people in the live audience, and I'm very, very grateful to you both for coming. And it's great to have all these people online. So I've never done a hybrid event before, so this is the first for me. So yeah, thank you for the introduction, Lydia. And I'm going to talk about, if I can get this mouse to work, which I can't. It's not working. And nor is this. Sorry about this. That's not working either. Maybe I'll just go and stand.
When we test them, and then when they should work.
I'm going to stand here and use this mouse, which doesn't work either.
Okay. Good.
Yeah.
It worked out.
This thing, yeah. Okay. Okay, great. Right, well, to begin begin at the beginning, and this is really just my beginning. What this talk is very much work in progress, but it's also quite I guess, a personal account of how I feel discussions about food have evolved during the relatively short space of time that I have been working on food, which is about 25 years, and there's a much longer history of work on food, and of course I am only looking at it from my own particular perspective, but a personal perspective is in some ways as good as any. So I'm going to start right at the beginning, which was when I first got into thinking and talking about food, when I was volunteering for a small organisation, which at the time was led by Professor Tim Lang, whose work you may know, that organisation in the 1994 published a report called Food Miles, the Dangers of Long Distance Transport. And I found it absolutely revelatory, because what it did was it drew attention to the distance food travelled, and used this as I guess you could call it a metaphor for examining everything that was wrong with globalization. So it was talking about ghost anchors, it was talking about power and profits and exploitation, and of course it was talking about the carbon impacts, the energy costs associated with trucking food from one part of the world to another. And I found that absolutely revelatory, and I liked it so much that I went off and wrote two reports called, one was called Growing Food in Cities and the other was called City Harvest, which are all about the benefits of growing food in cities and their sort of power, the power of urban food growing to bring people together, to address environmental problems, social change, to improve people's health, which was a striking example of the power of metaphor over reality, because I actually hate gardening and I really have never gardened. So, but as I sort of progressed, I began to think a little bit more, and I got talking to more people and started to think about this question of, is shorter actually better? From the perspective of greenhouse gas emissions. And this was at the stage when life cycle assessment was very, very new in starting, and it hadn't really been applied to food. It was just starting to be. And I came across some very, very early research which pointed out, which is now quite obvious to us all, which is that transport is only one aspect of the overall impacts associated with production, distribution, and consumption of food. There's a whole range of other impacts, and that we need to take this life cycle perspective. So this was kind of revelation number two, this life cycle thinking. And at the time, it struck me that there didn't seem to be, that the food had this massive set of impacts that I was just learning about, but there didn't seem to be anyone who was coming together to explore how the food system contributed to greenhouse gas emissions and what we might want to do to reduce them. So this was the rationale for setting up the Food Climate Research Network. And what it was initially called was the Lower Carbon Food Research Network, because I'd never heard of methane or nitrous oxide at the time. Cummings did it with an arts background. So I learned a lot during the course of that time. So the first, as I was going along in this sort of exploration of ideas about food and impacts, the first challenge was to explore the food and climate connection. And what became very, very clear from the research that was emerging was that the majority of the impacts were at the agricultural stage, so what it is we produce. And if you're talking about what it is we produce, you have to talk about what it is that we consume. So our diets are the main driver of environmental impacts, and how we change our diets will have a bearing on environmental impacts. Again, this is all very self-evident today, but it was quite new at the time. So you start to talk about that, and at the time we were talking about the supply chain, we were talking about just-in-time, and we were talking about supply chain vulnerabilities, which have become more and more, there's still live debates today. But again, once you start talking about diets and start talking about agriculture, you have to think about other things. You have to talk about health and nutrition. You have to talk about the well-being and the ethics of rearing animals for slaughter and consumption. You have to talk about people's jobs. And you have to take note of the fact that if agriculture is the biggest user of land worldwide, then its impacts on other life forms are absolutely profound. So you start to see that you can't talk about food and climate without talking about everything else, which is exactly the point that the Food Miles report made way back in the 1990s, but from a slightly different angle. Because I should say, during this time, the focus had really, really narrowed into discussions about climate change, and I was very much part of that. But you start to realise you have to talk about other things as well. And then, once you start talking about, okay, we have this big problem, everyone realises that there's a big problem, you get a flurry of arguments as to what we need to do to address this problem. And so I kind of threw myself into discussions about we need to eat less meat, we need to farm in ways that generate fewer impacts on wildlife and all the rest of it. And then you start, and gradually over time, we started talking about the supply chain, we was talking about the value chain, which was about the whole of, it was about the people somehow involved and the profits associated with it. And then once you start talking about what we ought to do, you start to see that there are all sorts of different approaches to what we might want to do about the food system. And that actually, while everyone agrees that we have a problem and that we need to change things, what the real causes of the problem are and what constitutes a solution very, very considerably. And that unless we talk about why it is that people disagree, I didn't feel we were going to get anywhere. So this really was the rationale for setting it. Sort of cut off a little bit here because you've got the talk. That's that thing going on. Sorry, it's the pictures of all the people online. But we can't get. So that was the rationale for setting up Table, which was to really explore why it is people, to explore what people really want, their visions, what good looks like, and why these vary. So that was the sort of potted history of the way I see things, and of course other people might see things differently. So where we are today, I think we have some recognition that the food system is not a supply chain or a value chain, but it's a system. A chain is something very, very linear and sort of very singular, whereas a system is something very messy and it has people in it and it has relationships. And I think we recognise that food is about relationships now. We have so many people and institutions working on food. It's really, really crowded now. We have 1 million analyses and we have all sorts of recommendations, and every day there's a new cutting edge report that's out there telling us that 10 top tips to save the planet. But I think there are very, very different prescriptions out there. And I think what we're seeing as well is even more polarization than there was right at the beginning. I felt that at the beginning there was a sense of, oh, we have a problem, we need to understand it, we need to figure out some solutions. But now I think it's getting kind of more bitter than it used to be. So I think this is just, I pulled out some pictures off the internet, you can find 1 million more yourselves, about the sorts of dynamics that are going on. So we have and I'm sure many of you followed the UN Food Systems Summit, which was very, very politicized, and figures like Bill Gates were either going to help, fix the food systems, or they were part of the problem, they were emblematic of the problem. We have endless discussions about what we ought to do about livestock, and I'm going to come on to that in a little bit more detail a bit later on, with some very, very contradictory framings of what, we have the kind of grass-fed beef are either going to save the planet or they are responsible for the destruction of the Amazon and the Cerrado and all the rest of it. We have veganism as the only way forward, the single biggest thing we can do to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, or some new kind of incarnation, excuse the pun, of kind of neoliberalism. So, and we have artificial meat as this revolutionary new thing, or same old, selling us the same old crap. And then of course you have ideas like neo-colonialism, which are, bandied about everywhere by people pro-agroecology and anti-agroecology. Whatever it is you don't approve of gets branded as that. So I think that's the level of discussion we're at the moment. So I think it's also the case that we have things that we thought were self-evident and true, at least that I thought were more self-evident and true, I've become more reflective of them, and I think we see that around. So, for example, the idea of sustainable healthy diet. I used to say this sort of thing, and I in fact I still do. If somebody gives me a really snapshot, what should I do, Tara, to have a lower environmental impact on the planet? I will say something like this: don't eat more than you need, eat a diversity of foods, eat less meat, eat more plants, don't eat junk, don't waste food. There are good reasons for all those things, but I think each of those statements you could question. So, for example, the don't eat more than you need, that raises questions of calories in versus the calories out. If I go running or if I go swimming, am I eating unnecessary food when if I didn't go running or I didn't go swimming, I would be able to eat less? Who gets to tell me what's too much? How does it feed into ideas about bodies and body fat and body image and body shape? How does it feed into all those sorts of discussions and the moralization that happens around that? The question of diversity, what do we mean by diversity? So are we talking about the reality of the fact that we have a greater diversity of foods at a supermarket near us in the West, if you have money, than at any other point in history? But this is a diversity of foods from across the world, but not, I guess, the nuance of different varieties of, say, lots of different kinds of carrots or lots of different ways of making bread that we might have had before. So what does it mean to be diverse? Then with the eat more plants and eat less meat. What kinds of meat? Is it red meat? Is it white meat? And again, this is stuff that I'm going to discuss in a bit more. But the question of which plants and which meats is subject to is the focus of a great dispute. And then the don't eat junk. I mean, one person's junk is another person's dinner. And I think there's a lot of moralization around that, and it's very, very difficult to kind of disentangle that. And then the kind of don't waste food. And I see all these sort of examples of things that are making use of wasted food. For example, the making beer out of old bread and things like that and selling it commercially. Is that genuinely a better use of the bread than turning it into a pig, feeding it to a pig first, where arguably you get more protein and a lot less intoxication? How do we judge different ways of utilizing food that you could argue a waste? Then if you go down a zero waste approach, you're actually risking a kind of a less resilient food system. So there's all sorts of questions around those apparently very, very simple bits of kind of homely advice. So I think it's become more complex, and I think, here's my sunset picture. We all want this sustainable food system, but I think we have very different visions of what good is. And again, as you all go about your daily work or your studies, you will be very, very familiar with some of the problems that we talk about all the time: climate change, jobs, nutrition, ethics, trade. These are all familiar words that are very, very important to get to grips with. And then we have a lot of argued ways forward, whether it's and a sort of some dichotomies going on there, the sort of the agroecology approach versus sustainable intensification. The policy instruments we should be using, whether that's taxes and regulation, or maybe more market-orientated approaches around certification, the role of public procurement, whether we should just focus on civic action, grassroots action, the role of education. So again, you will read recommendations that public procurement needs to be overhauled. We need to instill food education in schools from nurseries onwards. You hear all this stuff. But what's going on really? And I think there are deeper conversations underlying those sort of topical discussions. And I think they're roughly along the lines of these blobs on this slide. And I thought I'd just sort of go into them one by one. And I think this is the first one. At least it's the one that I got to grips with first, that I tried to think about first, which is the idea of what's really to blame for the problems we face. And these are age-old understandings of problems. I don't think they're new, and they don't apply only to food, but they're particularly acute in discussions about food. And one of the problems is that we're not yet smart enough. We need to get smarter. We need more tech. We can progress. We have always progressed. Things can get better if only we get smarter. That's one way of looking at the problem. So this is where your approaches like I don't know, carbon capture and storage come in, plant breeding, artificial meat, more efficient technologies, etc. Another way of looking at it is we're greedy, we're bad, the rich are grabbing everything, and we eat too much, we demand too much, we take up too much of the planet. And that has a very long kind of religious tradition associated with it, at least a kind of Judeo-Christian tradition. And then you have the other one, the third approach, which is like that actually the problem is not too much or not enough. It's about justice, it's about power structures, it's about who has and at the expense of what and who. And that what we need to do is reorientate the system. And I flip-flop between all of those, and perhaps you will do too, as well. And I think there isn't an easy way of saying, I don't feel like it. I think we see that in the discourse all the time, and we see alignments of these. So you have people who are saying that we're eating too much, and we also need to have more tech, or that we're greedy, and we also need to redistribute. We do see these realignments, but I think there are some fundamental disagreements going on there. And then I think, again, this is cut off from the top, but it's about where the locus of moral responsibility lies. So who has power, who ought to have power, and what it means to have power. And I think there's one way of thinking about the problems, which is that the problem is the individual, and that the individual has to take responsibility for themselves and do the right thing, read the right labels, buy the right food, and so on and so forth. And that perhaps also goes hand in hand with ideas about markets and certification schemes and education and information, and that there is a theory of change there, which is about if we know more, we will act better, and that we ought to know more, and it is our responsibility to be better. I think there's another way of looking at things, which is to say that we're actually just reproducing, or we're kind of zombies in thrall to kind of the powers that be, and the powers in this case are big food, who are kind of selling us their seductions and entrapping us, and indeed the poorer we are, the more entrapped we are. That's one kind of dynamic. There's another dynamic, which is that we need to put all our power in government, and the government should govern, they should regulate, and that they should have power, and we should give them more power. And there's another approach that says, like, the powers that be are not going to do anything. We need to take to the streets. We need to put change into our hands. It's bottom-up approaches. It's the only way to do it. It's the power of the masses. And then there's other, I guess, more academic approaches. Says everything is so fantastically complex, and that top left is that very, very famous and also notorious obesity map, which showed all the kind of the causes of obesity, and where do you start and what do you do with a piece of with a map, with a diagram like that, which is one way it's very accurate, you could say. At another level, it makes it very difficult to identify where change might take place. So I think that's another set of discussions about agency, power, and responsibility. I think there's another one which is about need and greed, which I find really, really difficult to think about, which is, again, there's a lot of moralizing framing the discussions, the rich, greedy West, the poor, deprived global South. There is a focus on the fact about meat as being this sort of symbol of greed, partly because you have to kill something in order to enjoy it, and there's all sorts of associations with that. There's also associations with greed because of its high environmental impact. But we have perhaps less obvious connotations about greed when it comes to something like drinking. Why is it that suddenly it gets moralized in different ways, you know, drunk binge drinkers on Saturday nights, but the idea that it is a sort of pleasure or a right to somehow, in our culture, to be able to drink, despite the fact that these are unnecessary foods who generate environmental impacts, but they don't get moralized in quite the same way as meat does, or indeed, you know, donuts. So again, we decide what's needy and what's greedy in somewhat contradictory ways. Is it greedy to go and spend 50 quid on a very fancy vegan meal in a restaurant when you really could be spending that money, I don't know, contributing to a social justice project or whatever it might be? What about vegan foods that have high environmental impacts? How do they get moralized? And then moving beyond the kind of the food domain, I go swimming in the Lido very, very regularly, and I love it, but I am contributing to keeping a pool very mildly heated, even in the winter. I'm doing something that needn't be done. I'm expending energy that I need to top up by eating more food. I have a cat who is kind of very greedy and who eats a lot of meat and couldn't eat anything else. And you know, how do we judge these things? But in food, there is so much discussion about need and greed and a lot of knee-jerkery, especially around the topic of meat. And it's kind of quite hard to disentangle. And then there are discussions about freedom. And again, because I flip-flop between the environmental and the academic movements, I sort of have different takes on this as well. There's ideas of sort of freedom too, which could be ideas about the freedom to choose from a million types of products, you know, 50 varieties of cereals, 50 directions for going on holiday, all these new opportunities and your career in life, self-fulfillment, all the rest of it. And then there's the kind of the freedom from the trappings of, you know, the flawed and dirty world. Again, quite a kind of religious reading of this, or a freedom from that commerce into a simpler, purer life, the kind of voluntary simplicity movement and growing your own food. But then there's also a kind of the freedom in a radical reimagining of the possibilities of what it is to be human and how to live and how to interact with the natural world, which again is not moralized, you know, the story of Eve and the apple and knowledge and all that, which can be read in all sorts of different ways. And I think, and they map quite interestingly onto that first slide that I showed about whether the problem is not enough technology or too much greed or too much injustice, because you can map this onto the first slide in lots of different ways, depending on where you want to go with it. So, you know, is a focus on technology part of a sort of corporate neoliberal approach to imposing our dominion upon nature, or is it a radical idea of self-imagining and freedom? You see what I mean? So, again, lots of discussions going on there. And then there's the question of nature and what it is and how we are in relation to it and how we ought to be in relation to it. Again, discussions about wilderness and rewilding and loss. So much discussion about loss in relation to what we've done to the planet. And I never know which nature we're talking about. So this is just a map of Europe over the, I mean, it's obviously a reconstruction, kind of, you know, based on lots of assumptions. But you know, which time in history are we talking about? Which Europe are we talking about? Maybe we're talking about the best time, which was back in the, I can't remember the dates on, sometime in the 14th century, during the Black Death, when this is a map of forest cover, went right back off because, you know, a third of Europe's population was dead. Are we talking? We're also talking about whether we're good for nature or not. Are we vermin? Are we taking up too much space, or can we live in harmony with nature? So we have a lot of discussions around that. And then we have nature and who gets to decide which nature. So we have all these discussions about rewilding and land ownership and and power in relation to that. And then there are lots of discussions about why we should work with nature. And often there is an assumption within the environmental movement that, of course, we should work with nature. But there's plenty of times when we really, really don't want to work with nature when it comes to our own fertility, for example, or with COVID vaccine, as another example. So how do we choose which bits of nature we want and which bits we don't? And then how it overlaps with ideas about kind of tradition and goodness and natural foods and so forth, and which bits of tradition and culture we think are really good and which are not. And I'm just giving an example from, I guess, my mother's culture, which is Greek Cypriot and Hispaniola there, and everyone says, oh, how marvellous, Greek food, proper food, not this trashy processed food. But whenever I make these, I feel like a bit like a domestic drudge. Somehow bits of me feels a little bit resentful of the whole wrapping of it. I'm quite glad that I don't have to do this on a daily basis and only when I want to impress someone. So yeah, and then there's the question of knowledge and whose knowledge counts. And again, I think sometimes this is people talking at cross purposes. But just to give some examples here, we have had discussions within the sort of nutrition world about things like nutrition labelling, and that we need to put food labels on things, and we need sort of things with low sugar and salt and calories and stuff like that. And you get to a situation like that where some ready-made chips really look very good. They're kind of green. And then there's a kind of very different take on it by the writer and researcher Georgie Skriniar, who you should read. It's very, I'm sure you have, who argues that this somewhat very atomized approach to thinking about individual nutrients is very reductionist, and what we need to be looking at is foods in their social and ecological context and their kind of their power context as well, and that the fruits are a kind of an abomination because they are not about food that we have agency in relation to. And I think there are different ways of understanding the world. So you have these kind of big models which work at one level, they give a certain kind of picture of the problems and of the options, and then that lived experience, field experience, which at another scale of resolution shows a different kind of picture of how things are and what a solution looks like. And then you have these very kind of contradictory, not contradictory, but they're kind of addressing things from different angles. There's the pastoralist report, which again you will all be very familiar with, which has a very different view on livestock, using very different ideas about which metrics count from this kind of that very famous paper in Science by Cora Nemechek, which gave a very, very different picture of what the role of livestock is in contributing to our problems. So again, these different kinds of knowledge, and sometimes it feels like we need to understand how these different kinds of knowledges fit together, and if that's even possible. I would like there to be some way of fitting them together, but I think that's probably overly optimistic. So, and then finally, I think there's this idea of, okay, so we have all these things, that's a lovely conversation, now what do we do? And do we have time to kind of dig everything up, uproot it, change everything, or should we just try and work with what we've got and sort of work with the system? Are we going for our vision of what good is, or are we just trying to kind of avoid what it is that we really, really fear and going for kind of second best? Do we go for, is there a moral hazard involved in going for approaches that we think are going to have deliver wins now, when they might lock us into futures that further down the line we really, really don't want? Or is it very, very dangerous to be very, very purist, because it's the kind of narcissism that you can get within academia, for example, when actually we just need to get on with stuff. How does change happen? Can we be motivated by, are we motivated by intrinsic ideas of what the right thing to do is, or are we always, and should we assume that people are motivated by external, ideas about prestige and status and so forth. What do we believe about people? Are we going to focus on the top down or the bottom up? Are we going to always be very cautious and risk averse, or should we go for what the eco-modernists call proactionary principle, a kind of something to see approach? So we have all these different ways of looking at it, and I just showed some of these pictures that the kind of the I am not a plastic bag, which has become a kind of status bag for reasons that mystify me. The idea of whether shame is a good emotion to induce in people, or whether fundamentally it's a very, very corroding thing to shame people into changing. And what we believe about the role of companies in saving the world's problems by producing carbon neutral bottled water. I don't know what we believe about all these things, but I think they all link to different theories of what will change. And in the meantime, this fundamental dilemma that we're always talking about, trying to think about, think or hurry. We have to do both, but they're kind of antithetical. So, where do we go from there? I've given this talk, that was really trying to sort of show the arc of at least my thinking and how it fits, how we do the time. We've got 5 more minutes. Yeah. How this fits into discussions about meat. So that's a subject that I'm kind of very interested in, and we're all familiar that there's loads and loads of debates. There's a lot of awareness of environmental impacts of meat. So what is the solution? And the solution is, I guess, based on how we think through those previous discussions about need and greed and all the rest of it. That there's one way of going, which is that, we want meat, it's inalienable, we're never going to change, this is who we are, we need to give people meat, we need to give it cleaner and greener and more efficiently. People like chicken offends nobody's religious sensibilities, it's the most carbon efficient meat, there's profit to be gained from it, you can turn it into nuggets, you can give them lean chicken breasts. Let's give people white, lean, clean, efficient meat, and we can breed animals to be to not feel pain or to be more docile, and we can solve our welfare problems. So there are no moral hazards involved in that. That is one way of thinking about how we address meat, and it is based on freedom too. It is based on technology. It's based on the way things are, the way things are, so let's just improve it. It's based on a whole range of ideas about that. Another way is a bit along similar lines, sort of hijacking it a little bit and saying, I buy into all this idea that people want meat, but let's bypass the animal and be more efficient still and go for the lab meat. There's another way of thinking which says, well, hang on a minute, we have reared meat for ages, nature is good, we are part of nature, we were born to eat meat, we are part of the land. What do animals do? They make use of resources that we can't consume directly, and they contribute to livelihoods, they're part of our culture, our tradition, and identity. We can eat meat, and meat is good for us, and it's good for the planet, and we can eat less and better meat. So that is a sort of pastoral, agrarian, humans in nature kind of vision. And then there's a fourth, which is a little bit more radical in some ways and very, very conservative in other ways. And then there's a final vision, which is that people can change, people should change their consumption. We're too greedy, we don't need meat, it's not nutritionally necessary, we should cut back, and we should all, we should go vegan, and there's a role for regulation and taxation and so forth, and we can make people be better, and people can be better. So then that's a very, very whistle-stop sort of tour of some of those ways of thinking about different futures for me. So in light of all that, it's all very complicated. There's all these ideas knocking around in everyone's heads all the time. How do you make sense of that? And how do you make policy? And how does change happen? And this is where I sort of peter out, because I don't really know the answer to this. I do know that change does happen. Mysteriously, it does, and things get, in my understanding, better in some ways and worse in other ways. So and maybe we're always playing catch up by saying, oh, that was the moment when this was how it happened. How you can anticipate those changes is perhaps more mysterious. I think what I can do is say how I think that one approach to change that I think is needed, and this is what the table is predicated on, which is that that we need to be more aware of what's going on in our discussions about food, that we need a more self-reflective approach to thinking about how we analyze the problems and why we articulate the solutions that we do, and that if we have a more if we have an approach that is more kind of reflective of our own ways of thinking and of other ways of thinking, that maybe we can take a kind of more nuanced and empathetic approach to thinking about other points of view. Now, in some cases, that might give rise to agreements, and in other cases, it may not. There may be fundamentally ongoing disagreements, and then what do you do with those disagreements? And there again, I don't have simple arguments, but I think there's a difference between disagreeing with somebody because you think they're a bad person, and disagreeing with somebody because, although you understand their point of view, you don't necessarily share it. And I think a more negative approach to thinking about this theory of change, about how we get to understand one another's perspectives, we can make more informed and nuanced decisions, is to think, what is the alternative? And I think the alternative we have today is a lot of inertia, ongoing disagreement because of ongoing disagreements, and some bad decisions. So it's not like this is the best way of doing it, but I can't think of a better way. So that's table, and you're all welcome to join it. This is just more blurb about it, and there's plenty more to read about on our website, which you can find here. And I'm going to leave it at that.
Classic way. Thank you very much for a really fascinating overview of some of the dilemmas that we all encounter as researchers, students, and just people who deal with food on a day-to-day basis. But also thanks for bringing us a positive message of hope and the possibility of consensus. We've had an interesting conversation about that just before the seminar, and I'm sure there'll be lots of questions about that point. Let's open up for questions or comments. We have about 25 minutes. I'm going to give the floor to the room first. So I don't want to put the participants on the spot here, but if you want to make a comment or ask a question, you'll have the floor first before we move to the online audience, which has made already lots of interesting comments, and congratulations for a very exciting presentation. So, any questions, comments from you? Let me just get the mic close to you so that colleagues online can hear you.
Lydia, I think it's that Zoom is only picking up the ceiling.
I think that's better.
Hopefully people can hear me. So I was wondering, you gave an account of the development of kind of discourse in food and nutrition science, which over the past 25 years. And one of the things you observed was it's become more bitter, more polarized. There's kind of more of a sense of people in conflict with one another about the solutions. And I wondered if you had an explanation as to why, specific to this field, rather than just the kind of broader, we're all getting more polarized about everything. Like what's been going wrong?
Thank you. Let's take another one.
So I have two comments or questions.
Can you take your mask off?
Sure.
Yeah.
Am I audible? So I have two comments or questions, however you want to deal it. So one is like you gave an overview about the food, the politics, and the ideas and the concepts in it. One is in innovation in the existing things that we do. Like for example, climate change initiatives as like tree planting and all that. Like for example, Pakistan is going through one of the largest climate change through, but they're planting like for example billion trees. But how much proportion of that is food trees, like fruit trees coming out of it, and how do we bring that into discussion? So like bringing in innovative things about food in the existing climate change parameters. The other thing is about how do we make these food debates and all of these concepts is political. Like for example, how do we drive a policy change that will come from however if we want to make it political. I don't know how to express it, about how to make that a part of political or policy debates in the normal people's discourse, like in the massive, how to make it, I don't know how to express it, how to make it part of the mainstream conversations or political debates. And that is, I think, how we can drive a political or a policy change. I don't know if I'm properly expressing.
I'll have a go. Were you talking specifically about Pakistan, or were you talking?
I'm talking about general. How do we make it part of the mainstream?
Okay, so your first question was about tree planting and fruit trees, and I guess this leads into discussions about nature-based solutions that are just kind of big everywhere, and people are thinking, well, you know, what is it the problems which this is a solution, and there's lots and lots of discussions about whether it's just another form of kind of not carbon mining, but the financialization of carbon, and whether nature just becomes a kind of form of infrastructure, and that food and justice and biodiversity are kind of excluded from this kind of race to sequester carbon. So I think, yes, you know, tree planting, all the rest of it is very important, and also the right trees in the right place where trees are the right forms of biomass. So I think that's just a kind of general point. When it comes to the kind of how do we make food more political, I'm going to see if I understand you correctly. I think food has become more political in some quarters. You could say it's probably amongst a very kind of small proportion of people, perhaps, you know, people who live in Brighton and people who live in North London and Oxford and places like that, where food has acquired, veganism has become very, very political, and not necessarily in a constructive way there. I think how can we get people to think that what it is you put in your shopping basket has socio-political and economic consequences I think it's a double-edged sword. So at one level, I think this idea of kind of the activist consumer making decisions about what they buy as a political act, and it has a kind of long history, and extending it more broadly about things like, I don't know, catering in the ideas canteen is a really, really important approach to try and foster. At another level, it does kind of risk falling you into an approach that says it is entirely your responsibility to make the right choices about what it is we buy, and that you alone have power to change the planet, and that, you know, the food industry and the policymakers bear little responsibility. So I think there's double-edged about that. I do think that there is an important role for obviously for the media, for education, and all the rest of it in trying to sort of provide that sort of context about the kind of the politics of food. And I think they have a role to play there. But I think it's also important in sort of less seen ways, for example, in sort of public procurement and in just the kind of the structures that shape our consumption. When it comes to your point, Tamsin, about why do I think food's become more politicized? Well, you know, I don't know if this is specific to food. If I'd spent, you know, my working life working on transport, maybe I'd found, you know, something very similar. But I think what does happen is that when something is new and fresh and everyone's finding out about it, it's all terribly exciting and there's all these ideas sparkling around, and then they become a little bit more kind of crystallized and they start to form kind of structures. And so I don't like your structure, I don't like your structure, I want a better one. And I think that happens as movements get larger and you start to have kind of factions and splinters forming. So I think that's probably, it goes hand in hand with building knowledge, but that's the best I can answer, really.
I have a question.
Let me just get first to you so that the others can do.
Hi. So thanks for just like going over all these kind of larger debates around food systems and food production. I mean, it seems like, would you say the main challenge maybe for policymakers then at this point is to find maybe synergies in these perspectives? I mean, I think if you really like break down a lot of these opinions, like maybe you can find grains of truth in any of them, and maybe you can really just see like whoever's advocating for them has some self-interest in putting that forward. So as policymakers, is really the challenge maybe not to become so like dug into like one perspective, but finding synergies, finding solutions that both address climate change and food insecurity and, you know, nutritious food access, and, you know, maybe even bolstering local food production, like finding those nexuses between perspectives.
You want to introduce yourself?
Oh, I'm Daniel, I'm a MA in food and development.
Great, thank you. Yeah, thanks for that question. I mean, I think there's lots and lots of things there. I think for a start, policymakers should, there's value in them recognizing that the water they're swimming in, sometimes they don't even realize that, you know, I have read government reports where, and so I'm sure have you, where they, you know, you read it and you think you've never actually thought outside this little particular kind of mini paradigm that you're working within. So sometimes it's just about, you know, getting them to think outside that. And obviously many people within government do, but a lot of them don't. I think it is really also important to understand why you come with a proposal and why it can create so much hostility. So I think it's about understanding why certain ideas acquire a level of toxicity. So, for example, policymakers who are focused on ideas of sustainable intensification. And, you know, I personally think that there's a lot of really, really good reasons for focusing on an approach that is about sparing nature and about trying to increase production or limit the production to existing land. But I have come to learn that it because of ideas about, and because of the history of kind of dispossessing people of their land, because of the way that these messages can become co-opted by corporations and so forth, ideas that seemed really good at the time acquire layers and layers of meaning and interests that make them very, very problematic. So you can't just kind of blunder in and say we're going to do X without really understanding. So I think there's that task of kind of understanding. And once you've done that, then maybe, then it's a question of kind of trying to understand the best of, you know, which ways forward. But you know, I'm also minded of the conversation that we had while we were having lunch with Lydia, who we were talking about this question of consensus, because the idea that you can take the best of, you know, urban food growing with the best of like high tech and the best of this and that, and like everyone's happy. People aren't ever going to always be happy, and I think that's also, it's always going to be very messy. But yeah, I don't know the answer.
That's the hard question to answer.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Thanks very much all here in the room for asking questions. Thanks, Tara, for very nice persuasive answers. Let's turn now to the online space where we have just under 30 colleagues waiting patiently, and there's been comments congratulating you another points made. There's two questions from two colleagues here, I guess. So I'll just read those out. So Hilton asks a lot of food-related action in the past related to soils, perhaps more than food. Is more consciousness about soil health a good starting point to depolarize the debate on meat? So that's one. Let me just move on to the next one from our colleague Ayako Ibata. So she's thanking you for the presentation. As you show, there are so many views about food. Can you share examples of these dialogues reaching to an agreement or collective view? Do the efforts to come to a consensus run the risk of reaching an agreement on low-hanging fruits and prevent us from trying out transformational ideas? We can see this in policy discussions where different parties and ideologies come to a compromise. This is a helpful process, but perhaps hampers countries and societies to transform our food systems. A very good question there.
Yeah.
You want to go for those two?
Okay, so the first one was about soils and soil health. So, well, yes, it is a very, very, very old set of discussions that comes in and out of fashion. It was perhaps rose to prominence back in, I guess, the 1920s with the rise of the Soil Association and the organic movement, which was founded in soils, and now it's having its moment again with the rise in thinking about, well, first it was sort of conservation agriculture, and now it's moved into ideas about regenerative agriculture. And I think, I think at one level, this is my personal view, it's very important to have focus on the thing that sustains all life on Earth, yes. But at another level, I find it becomes fetishized. I don't know who's seen the sort of Kiss the Ground Netflix documentary, which is basically soil porn as far as I can see. There's lots of ecstatically happy, kind of quite affluent looking people eating wellness oils and bowls and kind of digging earth and looking, and I think it fails to get to grips. I mean, I think there's a lot of hype about the power of soils to overturn all our soil, all our carbon problems, that if we just farm right, if we just graze right, then we can suck up all that carbon. It's kind of salvation by soils, it's kind of cleansing us of our sins, and there is a real risk that it diverts attention from the fact that we're still pumping these gases into the atmosphere, and we have to stop now. So I think the soil thing can be really, really overhyped. I think questions about regenerative agriculture, the environmental movement at one level have been, they were the people that were kind of focusing on ideas about soil and all the rest of it. But now they're very, very worried because Walmart is doing regenerative agriculture and Danone is doing it, and everyone's doing it now, and JBS is doing it. What does it even mean? So I think it's one to watch. On the question of consensus, look, I've been in discussions for quite a long time in the past about this whole thing on sustainable healthy diets. I am really sick to death of sustainable healthy diets and that phrase now, but I was in a lot of conversations about them, and I was as frustrated as everyone else by the conclusions, the allowable conclusion that could be come to by the end of it, which was that people ought to waste less food. Now, food waste becomes the acceptable face of behaviour change and a dietary shift, and all the important stuff gets sort of sidelined. So I have seen the risk of consensus in action, that it leads to some kind of platitudes and real kind of bland and kind of negligible outcomes. At the same time, it's a question of what you do with ongoing disagreement and conflict, and the extent to which conflict can be invigorating or enervating and dispiriting. And I think again, as we all know in our personal lives, sometimes you have a big argument with somebody and you both have a kind of, you feel energized and greater clarity. And sometimes it's just same old, and it goes nowhere. And so I do feel that some kind of aiming for, maybe consensus is too much of a loaded word now, and it's acquired its own connotations that make people shy away from it. But I do feel that there is a need to try and reach out and achieve some measure of understanding. Perhaps also a recognition that that isn't, and where that can be the case, agreement. I do also feel that compromise is necessary in the real world. We all have to do it, and that it is, yeah, it's the line you draw, isn't it, between totally selling out and conceding a few things as well. So I think it's a really context specific. There's always going to be a context specific way forward for that, and probably not a right answer.
Thanks, Tara. This is really fascinating. Thank you for opening up these really interesting topics, and really enjoyed your presentation as a personal journey. But I have a couple of reflections. One was, while listening to your personal journey, I had the impression of, you know, a steadily broadening scope and a sort of an increasingly kind of encompassing view of the systemic interconnections between all sorts of complex factors. And bearing in mind that, of course, your journey is not over yet, and I just thought, you know, how far is this complexifying going to continue, and you know, how useful is it? Because you could ask questions about consumption of all kinds, not just food consumption, and the things that sustain us, including shelter and clothing, the things that we consume during a lifetime, and think about the ethics of that and the environmental footprint and clothing miles and all of that. And just, you know, it's a kind of a very general dilemma, I think, for all kinds of intellectual pursuit, is thinking about, well, how systemically and how comprehensively is it useful? At what level of simplification might we say, okay, I'm going to, at some point, draw a line around the topics that I'm going to be concerned about? That's one. It's not really a question, it's just a sort of reflection. I'd be interested in your thoughts on that. The other one is, of course, it's disappeared from my mind now, is, it'll come back to me. But
Shall I have a go at
have a go at
that question? So, like, the really, really short answer is, like, that's what writing a book is for. And that's kind of what I'm doing in other parts of my time, kind of offloading some of this stuff. But I think, yeah, obviously you can't talk about food without talking about everything else. That this idea of consumption, which is really it's about human life, isn't it? It's about desire. It's about what we're here for, making stuff. And where do you draw the line? And there isn't one answer, so people go with what they're into. And some people like to focus very, very specifically on addressing one specific aspect of the food problem and taking one specific approach, and other people like to get very, very big in general. And I would say that it's almost like the same answer that people give to the question of, like, what's the best NGO to work for? Is it a small radical NGO that complains about everything and says everything's not good enough, or is it a big WWF type organisation that works with big industry? And there's a need for both, as far as I can see. And you go with where your predilections take you. So that's, well, where would you, throwing the answer back to you, where would you draw that?
No, that's a very reasonable thing to do. I think It actually came up in teaching this week because I was teaching about food systems and agri-food systems and presenting food system diagrams, and the question came up, you know, what is a food system and why are we talking about
Stopping
food
at
systems?
food, yeah.
So, you know, it raises a general question.
It does.
I think that you've made some, I like the way that you focused on people's personal predilections about what they care to focus on and how they like to spend their time. I can see that there's a hand up.
Yeah.
I have remembered my other questions.
That's Gil wanting to come in.
Yeah,
So
go
Gil,
ahead,
if you'd
Gil.
like to unmute yourself and show your face. Yeah. Thank you. Go ahead.
Yeah, hi. It's a bit based on your answer on my soil health question, because of course, there is no silver bullet, and there is a lot of greenwashing in agriculture. But I mean it for, I think, almost all good farming is based on farming which restores at least or maintains soil health. And I think the discussion about emissions and animal welfare, etc., they make a discussion. It's another level of discussion. While I think if you take soil health as sort of the basic, the necessary condition for whatever food system that you will develop in the future, that it might help to unravel some of those quite unfortunate debates about totally without meat or with animals for food health, or it's also taking serious problems of erosion, which are very important and also affect lots of smallholder farmers. So your comment about regenerative agriculture and that the big companies are using regenerative agriculture, I find a bit cheap. Can you react a little bit about taking it seriously, soil health? Because you didn't mention at all soils. You didn't scarcely mention farmers. Well, I think soil health and farmers are so essential for a good food system that you can't leave them out in your discussion.
Yep, I take all your points, and I think I'm certainly not denying that soil health is important, and you're right. I haven't mentioned farmers, and I think that's quite an omission. It's partly because I don't really talk to a lot of farmers, and that's not what I've done. But I think there is a real need to. And many people do, and I think there's possibly communities that work with farmers and kind of don't work with other aspects and parts of the food system, and there's a bit of a disconnect there, which perhaps needs to be bridged. I think so I'm not disputing that the focus on soils is really important. What I am questioning is the idea that, you know, it sort of goes back to the question that Dominic made. Maybe I'm rephrasing the question of Dominic's, which is that, you know, food can't do everything. You know, food production has to feed us, but it has an effect on wildlife, on kind of natural systems, so to speak. Whatever that effect is, it has. It's a human-made system, and so to expect it to also you know, some of the very, very substantial and quite exaggerated claims that have been made for producing food and also solving our environmental problems, I think need to be treated with some caution. So I think there's a difference between making that point about being cautious and skeptical, and denying the importance and the validity of focusing on soils. And certainly, I would agree that an idea of focusing on soils where you throw your nitrogen, you throw your phosphorus on the ground, and you know when the plants have sucked it all up, you just throw some more down and you keep it going until the whole thing packs in and you move somewhere else. there's not a way forward. But I think there is a risk that this becomes another silver bullet solution, or becomes framed in that way. And I think that's the only point I was trying to make.
And Jim is making the point there on the side. I don't know if you had a chance to notice that, Jim Sandberg, noting that here we are assuming that soil health is a meaningful and useful concept where it is very contested.
And I would say one other thing, and I'm absolutely not soil scientist, and I will remind you of my English degree. But if you talk to people who are, they will point out that soils in natural systems may look very, very different. They may be very thin, they may be lacking in carbon, and that is what gives rise to their unique ecosystems. So I think the assumption that carbon-rich soils are necessarily always good soils is also open to challenge.
Okay, Tara, thank you very much. I think we've hit 2:30 and we're quickly losing our online audience, but it's been a really fascinating seminar, and thank you so much for your work, the work that you're doing, organizing Table, which is a great resource for many of us, our student community as well. So I'm sure that many of us will, those who are not familiar with Table will now have a look and be inspired by that. The conversation will continue here at IDS. So thanks to the online colleagues for joining, and hopefully we'll see many of you here in the building sometime soon. So thank you, and thanks, Tara, again.